came as a student here the year I was born. And I have the privilege of having him as my teacher. Thank you so much. You can sit down now. Vern is a professor who got things done. And the practical application that Addison was talking about. And that's what our speaker does too. Dave, another Dave, can't ever have too many Daves. Dave E. was here, lots of Daves. Dave works for the Nature Conservancy, which is a global environmental nonprofit which is working to create a world where people and nature can thrive. I think it's a wonderful, very succinct mission. They were founded in 1951. The Nature Conservancy has grown to become one of the most effective and wide-reaching environmental organizations in the world. TNC has over 1 million members and a diverse and dedicated staff, and also 400 scientists work for TNC. And they impact conservation efforts in 79 countries around the world. They have big, audacious goals. For example, one of those is to one of their targets is to avoid or sequester 3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions annually, which is the equivalent of taking about 650 million cars off the road every year. So that's pretty amazing. That's their goal. So it's a big deal. Dave Livermore has been with the Nature Conservancy since 1980. And he was the first hired to cover the states of Utah and Nevada, working out of the Conservancy's Western office in San Francisco. And then in 1986, Dave moved to Salt Lake to open the Great Basin Field Office. And in 1995, then Utah became its own state program, and Dave has been the state director since that time. Dave has worked with many groups and agencies and individuals and foundations and corporations on major land and water conservation projects throughout his 42-year career with TNC. For example, Dave worked to acquire key wetlands and water rights on the edge of the Great Salt Lake that he'll talk about. He helped establish the Scott and Norma Matheson Wetland Preserve near Moab. And also the purchase and preservation of the Dugout Ranch near Canyonlands National Park. Dave has led successful capital campaigns in a very red state for very important topics. I think it's amazing his ability to work in, he knows where he is, and he's able to get things done. He's helped raise over $216 million in private and public funds for land and water conservation efforts in the state of Utah, and that has then resulted in the protection of over 1,050,000 acres of land in both private and public ownership. He's originally from California, and then he went across the country and graduated with honors from Williams College in Massachusetts. And then he received a Loeb Fellowship in Advanced Environmental Studies at Harvard University in 1994. He knew Carl Steinitz, and he even did it anyway. So if any of you know Carl. Dave supported a project here at USU, and that's how I got to know him. He generously funded a joint environmental education program for Utah's fourth graders. It was called Wings and Water. And it was taught at the Great Salt Lake Shorelands Preserve and also at the Botanical Center in Kaysville. And I was really, really fortunate to learn from Dave. So on this Earth Day Eve, it's an honor to introduce a man who is my friend and who has been a mentor to me and is really, truly one of my heroes. Dave?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dave. Can everybody hear me? Because I have a secret, and that is the little clip that usually goes on this little microphone is missing. So raise your hand if you can't hear me. I think we're okay. It's a great honor to be with all of you on this Friday before Earth Day, the 53rd Earth Day. What I'm hoping to do, other direction, is to give you a little overview about the Nature Conservancy and then talk about our freshwater initiatives and how we look at freshwater planning and conservation, and then drill down on the Great Salt Lake. And I'm greatly intimidated because I heard the wonderful student presentations, capstone group, and at the end, Todd said, "You all pass." So I'm hoping at the end of this presentation that I passed. I want to start with by mentioning a writer and conservationist, Wallace Stegner, that some of you have heard of, Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the key advocates for the Wilderness Act, passed in '73. And Wally had a great phrase that's written here that he'd like to see the West both environmentally healthy and prosperous with a civilization to match its scenery. And that notion of a civilization and the scenery, not just the urban environment and not just the natural world, but how do you blend the two? And this is an increasing challenge for all of us. And I think those of you here that are studying landscape planning and architecture and the environment, that's kind of the sweet spot. How do we have both? And he was on our board, incidentally, for several years. So what does the Nature Conservancy do? Basically, our tools are three: protect, transform, and inspire. So protect is basically our bread and butter, acquiring natural areas, working with water, lands, and streams and habitat. And then transform has to do with policy work. Now, we're not out there hitting the headlines, but we do advocate for funding for conservation and also for some changes in local water laws, you'll hear. And our third leg of our stool is to inspire people, particularly young people, to get more involved in conservation. And our mission is to preserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And as Dave mentioned, the organization has grown a lot since I've been around. When I started, we had 400 employees. Now we have 4,400. And we're 72 years old this year and have preserved lands and river miles all over the nation. So, just to touch on our international programs and over the globe, India, Caribbean, Australia, our largest international programs in China, actually, at this time. And all this began back in '51 when certain members of the Ecologist Union were noticing, they were back east, that a lot of their protected areas were disappearing. And they banded together and formed something called the Nature Conservancy. And a founding member of the Nature Conservancy was actually Dr. Walter Kahneman at the University of Utah. He was like the sole Westerner. And he was studying the hybrid oaks of the Wasatch. Some of you know Red Butte Garden down in Salt Lake. The visitor center is named after him. And I have no evidence of this, but I'm thinking, since he was an oak man, that possibly our logo came from Dr. Walter Kahneman, because we've always had the oak leaf. As Dave mentioned, we're science-based, and of our large staff, over 400 scientists of all different stripes that help us guide our work, where we should protect lands and waters, and also how to steward and manage them. And another thing that makes us a little bit unique is that we don't litigate, we don't kind of raise a ruckus. All of our transactions are willing seller, willing buyer. We mix good science with good sense. We like to say that we aren't on the radical left, we're not on the radical right. What's really difficult is being the radical center and trying to get things done. Of course, I mentioned the forbidden rival University of Utah, so I have to give equal time to all of you Aggies and mention that in addition to Brian Steed and Dave and others, a large number of our employees are actually Utah State grads, from Chris Brown, our stewardship director, the number 2 scientist at TNC, Joni Ward, our director of conservation in Colorado, government relations, Tim Stewart. Some of you may have heard of the names Huey Johnson, who was an early graduate. He's passed now, but he started the Trust for Public Land, used to work for the Nature Conservancy. And then we'll talk a lot about the lake. We got started at the Great Salt Lake because of Utah State. because of Jess Lowe and John Cadlick. So we love the Aggies, and we also love ice cream, your ice cream. So I'm not going to talk about all of our conservation projects, but just to give you a little smattering, kind of a tour around the basis of the types of projects we do. This is out in the West Desert, trying to protect sage grouse habitat, using conservation easements, about 10,000 acres protected that way. Dave mentioned the Norma and Scott Matheson Wetlands Preserve, 900 acres, the largest wetland on the Colorado River down near Moab. Very different type of project down in the Escalante, where we have worked with partners, Escalante River Watershed Partnership, to restore about 90 river miles, 5,000 acres, by removing tamarisk from that area. And down in Washington County, I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you kind of ranked all the counties in Utah in terms of their biodiversity, Washington County is a hot spot, lots of endangered and threatened species, very involved in working along the Virgin River itself, trying to protect habitat there. This last purchase was called Sheep Bridge, and as you can see, we're working with partners to try to do more down in that area. And perhaps an area or a project we've heard about because we do a lot of partnerships with Utah State at the Dugout Ranch, is this amazing, it's a 350,000 acre ranch that we've basically turned into a research center. That number includes federal leases. We have about 8 research partners, 30 research projects going on in different disciplines. A lot of them are climate focused, and a couple of doctoral students working with the Red family, Heidi Red, who is kind of legendary in that part of the state, a great conservationist in her own right. And again, Utah State, we actually have a cooperative agreement with Utah State in helping to manage and conduct research in that area. It's right in the middle of Bears Ears. It's the largest private inholding in Bears Ears. So we're involved in that discussion. And actually, this is our project manager, Matt Red, who made the cover of National Geographic. And then on a larger scale, our 6 chapters in the Colorado River Basin have joined together to try to work on the whole Colorado River watershed with partners. So that's what we call a landscape scale conservation project. And any one of these I could talk too much about. Of course, of the pillars of our work overall, of course, land and water protection, climate is right up there, as well as connecting people and nature. And we work closely with Utah Clean Energy. That is a great local NGO that works on climate issues, both nationally and locally. We're involved on that issue. And then we sponsor outreach events. We're lucky to have Jane Goodall with us here a few years ago. So that's kind of the Cook's tour of our work here in Utah and beyond. But we're here to talk about water and about the Great Salt Lake. So I'll move into that area. So our key of our freshwater initiatives, kind of like our overall philosophy, is to make sure that there is both water for people and water for nature. And I have to quickly add that this wonderful quote from Taylor, that the story of climate change is written in water. So there's such a clear correlation between climate issues and water issues that they're sometimes really the same. This cartoon is my favorite because it kind of describes the state of play for water issues in Utah. And here's the kind of the negotiation table. This is a Pat Bagley cartoon with all the stakeholders. And one of our goals is to make sure that nature has a seat at the table. So we kind of, in the office, figure out who represents us. Maybe it's the woman with her trowel, who knows. But let's make sure that nature has a seat at the table as these large water decisions are being made. So how do we approach freshwater policy? 4 pillars. The first is science, which are science-based. And if we made it to the table, and someone shouted across and says, okay, you made it to the table, you nature people, how much water do you need? How much water do you need to protect the Bonneville cutthroat trout or the Virgin River spine dace or other species? And so we want to be able to answer that. So some of our work is involved in ecological research, monitoring, and just trying to pin down, because it's not always amounts of water. Sometimes it's timing, sometimes the type of flows. So science is the first pillar. The second pillar is what we've been working on a lot for the last 4 or 5 years, which is the laws that enable the purchase and lease and water rights, and how to make them more current and appropriate to the current times. So a lot of policy work there. The third is less familiar in Utah, but certainly other states, is if you have water structures like dams and canals and head gates and so forth, how do you run them? How do you manage the kind of on and off? How do you manage them, since they exist, to help species better? And the final piece is, how do you pay for all the work in water work? So some of you have been watching the headlines about, certainly Representative Brad Wilson has been very active. We'll get into that in our local legislature. One of the first things we were able to work with the legislature on, this is way back in 2020, is passing Utah's first water bank legislation, which allows farmers to pool their resources, not lose their priority right, but if they don't use their water, they can actually dedicate it for a time to conservation. And that took a tweaking of our laws, and we've actually been doing more tweaking with the legislature ever since. And the first water bank was approved out of the Price River a few years ago. So I wanted to pause a second and show a little video that talks about this project. Now you say, well, this is miles from the Great Salt Lake, but the video I'm about to show kind of captures how important it is to work with agriculture, right? Because agricultural and farmers and ranchers really hold most of the water. So how do you form partnerships? We say that conservation happens at the speed of trust. So this video, even though it's about the Price River, can apply just as well to the Great Salt Lake. So the miracles of technology, I'll see if I can play it.
We're the third or fourth generation operation. I actually grew up there. This is my parents' third generation. Ag is a challenging game wherever you're at in the United States. It's even a little bit harder here. We're at a high elevation, we're extremely dry climate, and our water sources are limited. Water's the lifeblood of the West.
Water's everything. We're the second driest state in the United States. So we need to take care and use our water the best way we can. If there's anything that's going to stop any growth in the West, it's going to be water.
So this right now currently is basically carrier water.
Working on the Price River in Utah to try and figure out how we can address certain flow needs in the lower Price River, which often goes dry in the summer months.
This is a flood control gate. We have fiber up on the 27-mile-long canal. This one is actually inoperable at this point in time.
We started our partnership there working with the Carbon Canal Company.
Carbon Canal Company is actually a water delivery company. We divert water out of the Price River. We have 250 shareholders. We deliver water to approximately 11,000 acres. We have 27 miles of open canal.
We were invited by some of the partners there to come up and help them figure out if we could address some of their water needs.
I'm as guilty as anybody else. Ag people tend to look at any kind of conservation groups as the enemy. Thank goodness we were smart enough to sit and listen to them and see what they truly did have to propose and their ideas and thoughts.
We're Americans. We're independent. We was born and bred that way. But none of us independently, as ranchers and stuff, have the money or the capability to do this. With Nature Conservancy coming in, they're going to give us a hand to do that.
They found resources to get a flood control gate replaced. And then the next thing is the Olson Reservoir project.
The goal is to bring water that's not being delivered to shareholders from the Carbon Canal over to Olson Reservoir, enhance the wetland habitat here, but also store it so that we can later strategically release it to the lower Price River.
Things will be a lot different at Olson Reservoir again. It'll be more like when I grew up. It'll be wildlife there that'll be done. It'll just bring life back to that area where it has kind of slipped away at this point because there's lack of water there. We're going to bring a lake back to life out in the middle of the desert. We align more with Nature Conservancy than we disagree. And they worked really hard to make it even easier for us to align with them. I feel a real burden not to drop the ball and to continue on and to grow. My folks gave me a lot more than what they started out with. And I would like to leave that same kind of legacy, leave my kids more than what I started out with. So ag producers, ag people are the stewards of the land. I mean, we're just the caretakers. And honestly, we are environmentalists. And at the end of the day, we all have the same goal. We have to do the very best that we can with what we have and to take care of it and try and improve it. That's the end goal.
Okay, that gives you the idea of our approach and the way we like to build partnerships kind of on the ground. And that's not conservation policy in Washington, right? That's right where the water is, down on the ground. Okay, let's focus now on the Great Salt Lake, which is what we're all about. This whole series has been, I've been familiar with what you've all put together, thanks to Dave and others and time. So our organization, kind of using traditional tools, has been involved actually acquiring uplands and wetland habitats around the lake for 36 plus years, and about 11,000 acres around different refuges, additions, and other places. You can see here in the center our kind of anchor property or project is something called the Great Salt Lake Shorelands Preserve, which has been pieced together by acquiring these lands over all this time, 44 different transactions. So that's a lot to, over time, to get to know folks and reach agreement on purchasing their lands and water rights. And it's a place you can now visit. As we have facilities for visitors, boardwalk facilities, and educational facilities. And just a little comment, and I have some comments at the end about landscape architecture and design, but of course we hired a landscape architect to develop not only the siting of where these facilities went, but also their design. So you guys are in the sweet spot for us. Thanks to Dave, we've really enjoyed this Wings and Water program. Over 20,000 fourth graders now have gone through the program over about 10 years, learning about ecology, restoration, and about the ecology of the lake. They haven't really been out to the lake much. We have a curriculum and brochures and volunteers that take them around to teach them about a place that many of them have never really even been to. And you're probably wondering, well, you acquire these lands, what do you do with them? A lot of times, very active management is required. This is Chris Brown, lower right. He's a Utah State graduate that is our Director of Stewardship. And so we're involved with not just education, but phragmites removal and water management and building new wetlands. And standing back a second, 30,000 feet, what do we care about this place? There's so many reasons. I love the presentations, the capstone presentations that kind of were focused on why we loved the lake. When I started, no one loved the Great Salt Lake, and no one even knew where it was. So we care for a lot of reasons. Of course, the lake is one of the most significant natural areas in North America, and it's an epic center for shorebirds and waterfowl on the Pacific Flyway. These are just a few of the kind of data points. 10 million shorebirds utilize it, 250,000 American avocets, California gulls. My favorite are the phalaropes that rise up out of the Arctic. They fly down along the Pacific Flyway, the eastern spur of the Pacific Flyway. They come here in August. They double their body weight eating brine flies, and then they fly to Argentina for the winter, all in one flight. So just teeming with wildlife. That's one of the reasons we love Great Salt Lake. And of course, California gulls. But there are other uses of the lake. The brine shrimp industry, of course, is an important user of the lake. Recreation and tourism. Maybe some of you enjoy paddling or better days, even sailing. And the extractive industries, U.S. Magnesium and others that get phosphates. There's historic and cultural significance. This is kind of an interesting backstory. This is Fremont Island that John C. Fremont visited in 1843. He actually named Antelope Island because there were a lot of antelope at the time on Antelope Island. But he came out there, paddled out in his bull boat and mapped the area. And he was, one of the early explorers to know this area and found still a lot of cultural artifacts and the importance to the Shoshone people of the lake in terms of trading salt and other cultural experiences. Outdoor classroom, I mentioned. And then this is a story of migration, these amazing distances that birds cover. The Great Salt Lake is kind of like a gas station, a way station for birds to rest at. So working with the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, this is before the current low levels of the lake. We did an analysis. The lake adds about 1.3 billion to Utah's economy. And we were involved with other partners in forming something that's called the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. The Chesapeake Bay has a regulatory entity, the Puget Sound. We kind of raised our hands and said, there's 30 different jurisdictions from local county and city planning ordinances and fish and game, fish and wildlife. They're not coordinating. Could we get a coordinating agency together? And the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council has existed doing this for some time. And again, before the low levels, although it's been low for a long time, there is this 12 water strategies for the Great Salt Lake, which is a great document that I can get to you if you're interested on kind of what to do about to save the ecology of the lake and the economy. But now we're living this brand new era. For the last 2 summers, we've had record lows in terms of recorded history from the time the pioneers came. In 61, we actually had close to these low levels, but nothing quite as dire circumstances. And so this was noticed by, of course, all of us in the conservation community, but also by Brad Wilson in the legislature and others. And I have to give Brian Steed credit. Is Brian here somewhere? Anyway, he's working with the Quinney Center. When he was DNR director, he was largely behind some of these, planting the seeds to create awareness on the lake. And this summit, there's been several summits, was a kind of a wake-up call. Everybody's heard about the birds and the ecology and the flyaway, but what about human health? What about if the salt pan dried out and dust storms blew along the Wasatch Front, bringing toxins? And there's a great example of this, the Owens Lake in California on the eastern side of the Sierra, that city of LA drained all the water. Now they've spent about $100 million a year trying to pat down all the dust. So that got the attention of the legislature. And amongst other bills, one thing that passed is Senate Bill 410, which creates a water trust, Great Salt Lake Water Trust. And in Q&A, I can describe more details on this. But we were involved in helping with the legislation and then selected with Audubon to run this water trust, which is just beginning. But water trusts aren't that new. They're actually called water funds in many places. The Conservancy's been involved in about 40 of them around the world, really, from Quito, Ecuador to the Truckee River in Nevada. And the goal is to actually restore lands, I've got a slide here, to enhance water flows through acquiring and leasing water rights, to do restoration efforts upstream, to handle where water is distributed, and then to leverage the funding that's out there. And that's kind of the goals. One thing to point out for those of you who are econ majors, maybe not a lot in this room, I don't know, But the 40 million is actually going to community foundation, a fiduciary that kind of manages the money and looks after it, and then we allocate it to projects. This is kind of the graphic that the projects are submitted to the staff of the trust. There's an executive committee, and there's an advisory committee that's just been appointed. And this is by legislation with different functional areas, or at least interest areas, from ag to private landowners, duck clubs, conservation organizations, aquaculture, mineral extraction. What's really unique about the Great Salt Lake is normally environmentalists are at odds with some of these industries, but take, for instance, brine shrimp or even the mineral extraction. None of these businesses do very well if they don't have a healthy lake. So if, for one example here, we all want the same thing. We want a better lake, a healthy lake, because the rising tide supports all boats. The trust is in the strategic planning process. It's really just begun to get active. And you can see, again, our water investments. We also have wetland investments, and then some conservation initiatives as well that we're promoting. So that sounds very theoretical, but about, time goes by, about a month ago, I guess, the LDS Church donated 20,000 acre feet of water to the lake that the trust is actually managing as kind of to prime the pump. And now I'm going to take you back to that video I showed, all those farmers and ranchers, they distrust everybody. How do you get other people to join in? Well, this certainly helped to set an example. Maybe there will be more. Oops. Okay. And you get very technical as to where the flows come from. Certainly the Bear is the major source, but the Weber and the Jordan, and of course all the western side of the lake is essentially barren, has no water flows and no wetlands. So we're focused primarily on acquiring and leasing water rights and benefiting the wetlands and the lake as well. And this is the type of analysis. I'm not a hydraulic engineer, but to really get granular on where you should be working, you have to know the hydraulic mapping and how to take care of it. So kind of wrapping up, in addition to the science and to the policy and working with the legislature, we're involved in raising private funding for the lake. The Nature Conservancy is always out there doing things. We have a new campaign called the Nature Unites Us campaign, which is really that notion of, whatever ethnicity you are, or whatever economic background, wherever you're from, we all have to breathe clean air and clean water, and nature really unites us in ways that we'd like to think transcends some of the conflicts that exist in America today. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with this little video, and then we'll go into Q&A.
What do you and she have in common? You share something great. The greatest snow on Earth depends on Utah's greatest lake. As the Great Salt Lake shrinks, its loss threatens our snowpack and our watersheds. It threatens our health, our economy, and our joy. It threatens their survival. Nature is our greatest gift. When you care for it, you care for all of us. Learn how nature unites us.
Running that on some social media channels. So let me just end with this slide. I'm not a trained landscape architect or planner, but I was thinking about you all are the future of the world. It sounds kind of corny, but it's true, because us old guys are going to fade away. So what you're learning here is so important and really transcends the actual graphs that you're putting together, your charrettes and so forth. What strikes me about the discipline of planning, architectural, landscape architecture, is you're essentially solving problems, right? You have a kind of a series of factors. You have to figure out how to design a greenway or a ballpark, or how to spatially understand the world. And that's the second thing, is that I hate to say this because I'm a history major and I'm kind of an old-fashioned reader. I read books, but no one reads books anymore. So the fact that you all know how to use ArcInfo and GIS and to create diagrams. I mean, that is a huge talent that, again, transcends just architecture. Number 3 here is really something I've noticed in my time in Utah is that we used to be acquiring and protecting lands that were kind of out there, out in the wild country, the Deep Creek Basin, stuff in the Strawberry River. Our first purchase at the Great Salt Lake was in '84, and there was nothing out there. It was just like, what are you doing out there? Why bother? And now, of course, the development is right up to the border of our shorelands preserve. And so, as students studying that urban interface between, again, Wallace Stegner, civilization and matched scenery, between civilization and the natural world, that's something you're learning here, which is very valuable. And of course, collaboration with stakeholders. I love with the capstone presentations how some of the presenters described, interviewing folks and getting to know people in the field, and then this whole theme of building places where people and nature thrive. So that's kind of what you're studying and what we're doing, which is why we love Utah State. So I'm going to end there, do some Q&A. I do have one final video at the end when everybody's kind of done, and that'll launch you out in the world for Earth Day tomorrow. So Dave, I guess, or whoever's going to do the Q&A. Yep.
Any questions to start us off?
Silence. You guys are almost ready for the weekend, I can tell.
So you talked a little bit about how your work only moves as fast as the trust that you can build. What are some ways that you have been able to build trust and could see us being able to build trust as we work with people on both sides of what has become a conflict in some ways?
Great question. Again, I don't have the perfect answer, but one of the goals we've had as we work on conservation projects, not just the Great Salt Lake, is to have people on the ground in communities who are working. For instance, we have an office in Moab, and we're active at the Matheson Preserve, a Dugout Ranch. And so right there, you have that kind of intangible, these relationships our staff has with people from the Forest Service, the BLM, local ranchers. You have that community connection. So that's one area. Another is kind of, you may not expect me to say this, but I'm a liberal arts guy. So words are important. What words do you use talking to, you might say, people who are skeptical? For instance, we did some focus groups and learned that the word environment in Utah is kind of negative to a lot of people, believe it or not, because they associate it with kind of, crazies. But stewardship tests very positively. And if you connect with oftentimes the agrarian past, that even people in Utah cities, they're just one generation away from the farm. So make those personal connections. And also just show, like kind of the video, that we're not just out here to sound the alarm, but how can we work together to kind of come to a solution? Not easy, but those are some ways to build trust. Yeah.
How poison is the air that's blowing off the lake, and how big is it a threat to the local population, and how far does that threat extend?
Great question. Did you all hear the question? How poisonous are the dust storms that come off the lake and to human health? I'm not a scientist. I know there are people both here in the university looking at putting dust monitors around and to analyze the content. It's interesting. My wife asked me, why are all these metals in the Great Salt Lake? Is it a bunch of miners that have been putting them there, or some big factory? Well, actually, of course, it's a terminal lake. So trace minerals like even, let's say, arsenic or selenium are actually everywhere. They're in the mountains, but they are dissolved in the streams and come down to the lake, and they evaporate, and so they concentrate. So it's not that any one mineral is dangerous. It's more it's a concentration. The other thing that they're studying is kind of so interesting is just because you might have a dry salt pan doesn't mean that everything that's barren when the wind comes becomes airborne. There's certain bacteria or types of crust formations that actually some of the hard pan doesn't blow up. So they're looking at where on the lake is the most worrisome. And then, there are groups, Physicians for Social Responsibility and others who really are looking at, through these monitoring guides and gauges, kind of what types of things are we breathing. But right now, the lake it's not totally gone, right? Particularly this year. So we haven't had the extremes that they've experienced down at Owens Lake, but that's what we're all worried about. Yeah.
Dave, are you available for cloning? Have you made that available?
Cloning?
Yeah.
Well, these are all your students. They're all going to do the work when I'm long gone. So,
I guess
you mean, is the organization? Are you talking about me or the organization?
No, you.
Oh, okay.
We appreciate all that you've done and all that you do. How do we speed this up? At an executive level, have you talked about how we get after this whole thing faster?
Well, I mean, it is kind of just amazing to me. I've been doing this for years, and I'll just give you one anecdote. You notice that one slide we have the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, which was kind of an idea to bring people together to coordinate. And in the statute that creates the council, it is required that we report to the legislature. And the entity is about 15 years old now. And for years and years, even though it was required, we'd go to the legislature and they wouldn't even put us on the agenda. It's like they don't care about some Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. They got bigger fish to fry. Of course, that totally turned in the last 2 or 3 years. It's I think because of the human health issue. It's and actually I should have emphasized this more. It's not just that Owens Lake is you might say dangerous in terms of dust storms, but it's very expensive to the city of LA putting in tens of millions a year. They put gravel out and they have a different process, and so I think that the governor is interested. Brad Wilson, who's the Speaker of the House, and then even on the federal level, Blake Moore and has joined together on a kind of a funding for more research. Even Mitt Romney got behind some federal legislation. But it's also, Mother Nature is out there, so you can't legislate rainfall. So, there's one question.
Dave, as one of the managers, along with Audubon of the $40 million trust, what are your priorities for the use of that money?
That is a great question, because I think there's a kind of a misnomer that, I mean, 40 million is a lot of money. Don't get me wrong, but that will take care of everything. It actually will just start the process. And it's also a misnomer that, the only goal is just to kind of have the lake just come back. Really, what we're starting to think is where are the ecological hot spots? Where if you have some water, should you put it, out in the general lake, or should it flow into Farmington Bay, or possibly Brigham City? And so it may be in the long range, unless the full lake comes up, that, I'm just being honest, that the goal really is to preserve the ecological values of the lake. We'd love to have the whole thing come up, but there's not enough money in the world probably to buy so many water rights that it would do that. So that's the priorities are the hot spots. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. The last question, and then the video.
Okay, so you've been at this thing for a while, right? And you've seen where GNC and many other groups have actually been trying to sound the alarm, and you've had lots of stuff going on out there, research and stuff, and you wisely purchased a bunch of water rights and land you've acquired, and you've consolidated some things, and you've quietly been doing that. Nobody even asking for a report, right? So, but okay, now it's on fire, and it's a pretty serious situation. What do you really believe? This is a loaded question, but do you think we can fix it?
Well, again, it's like the last question. What does fix it mean? Do I believe that we can raise the whole lake up level, 3 or 4 feet? I mean, depends on, frankly, the climate.
What in your mind is fixing it?
Well, what is success?
Yes.
And, our lens is kind of like the blind man and the elephant. I mean, we see the ecological values, the mineral companies see the mineral values, but, in our world is to make sure these wetlands that are these magnets for millions of shorebirds and waterfowl, and they're the interface, like you all understand this, between the fresh water that comes off the mountains and meets the salt and creates the essentially the plant life that creates wetlands. So that's success if over the long term, I'm sure that they are. But what's convenient is, again, if they're protected, it probably means enough water where the brine shrimp industry can survive. So I've been doing conservation stuff many years, and this is pretty rare where you're actually collaborating with industry. And that's, I think, another reason, actually, just should have mentioned this, why the politics are starting to line up. It's not just the Bugs and Bunny people. It's industry, tourism, aquaculture, and even farmers. And they don't want to have toxic dust blow on their crops. So it's an alignment, frankly, of such magnitude I haven't experienced before. But it all depends on not just talking, but also doing. So, okay, I think we're good. Okay, I'd just like to wrap up with it's getting close to Earth Day, so we have to have an emotional and fun video before you guys head out and enjoy the weekend. So let's see if this one works.
This life is an exploration, and you gotta see what I see in you. I can't wait 1 minute more. Sun to shine, sun to shine. We can't wait 1 minute more. Sun to shine, sun to shine. There's a key that opens the door. Will you find it and turn it? Take your time, don't take too long. There's a map that stops the shore. Will you find it and burn it? Unleash your imagination. 2 stars, 1 constellation. Bright lights just to guide the way. Can you see what I see in you? I can't wait 1 minute more. The sun will shine, the sun will shine.
Okay, let me just leave you with one quote. Some of you might remember Scott Matheson, former governor of Utah. Those of you a little younger probably don't, but he was on the national board or global board of the Nature Conservancy. And in his second inaugural address, he had a great saying that I've taken to heart, and it goes like this: "We stay only a moment, and then we're gone. While we're here, let us do all we can to honor the past and secure the future. It is now our time, and there is much to do." For all of us, it's now our time, and there's much to do. Thank you for listening to me and for this great session.